white cloth covering his knees stirred, the bishop first thought it was a draught from the smoky chapel, but the cloth rose on its own, slowly, as if something beneath it were breathing. One of the participants stood with outstretched hands, waiting for a gift, but the Holy Father suddenly sank to his throne and let out a wet, hoarse groan. The cloth slid off his knees, and the first worm slipped out from under it. That day, the 19th according to the old calendar, was recorded in the archives of the Cathedral Curia as the day without liturgy. Witnesses, servants, junior deacons, palace guards gave written statements, which were later included in a report to the Inquisition. None of those present could explain how the Holy Father's body had ended up in such a state, as he had not been reported ill or isolated from the liturgy. Pope Urban, who had been on the throne for 8 years, did not leave the north wing of the palace during the last weeks of his life. He was rarely seen in the cathedral. The official cause was given as exhausting joint inflammation, but the records of the papal physician, found in a sealed chest several months after his death, painted a more disturbing picture. Extensive purulent abscesses, ulcers with blackened edges, and a foul odor that intensified at night. The first signs of the illness appeared in November. According to his valet, the throne bearer could not feel his feet, urinated on the sheets, his face was waxen, and his mouth tasted of decay. The Pope refused food, but ordered that consecrated wine be brought to him daily. He was convinced that he was suffering from internal temptation, and demanded that the monks read exorcism prayers over him. When the court physician tried to apply a remedy made from valerian root and sulfur, the skin on the Pope's back swelled and burst. Servants claimed to have seen something dark crawling across the bed. One of the nuns died of fright. Another had her tongue cut out for spreading rumors. The record of the bloodletting performed on the 3rd day of the illness has been preserved in the archives of the 3rd Medical Council. No more than 3 mouthfuls of thick, blackened blood were extracted from the Pope's right vein. After the procedure, his blood pressure dropped and his breathing became irregular. Immediately afterwards, he began to hallucinate. The Pope screamed that he saw a monk with no eyes standing at the foot of his bed, and that a snake was flowing from the pillows. He spent several nights tied up with cloths to prevent himself from pulling out his own nails and teeth. The wounds on his fingers became infected. Mice began to appear, attracted by the stench. 3 servants were punished with whips for not closing the cellar grate. Later, it became clear that it was not the mice. Worms appeared out of nowhere. The report of the prefect of the guard states, "His Holiness's resting place has become unfit for habitation. The smell is such that the room can only be entered through cloths soaked in vinegar. Lice have appeared. His clothes have rotted on his body." Despite this, the Pope himself forbade changing the sheets and did not allow anyone to approach him without his blessing. He believed that his body was suffering for the sins of the church. There was talk of a curse. The senior vicar, a man of the old school, insisted on performing a ritual of general purification, but the cardinal from Siena objected. If the ritual was performed incorrectly, it could only hasten his death. Inaction prevailed. 3 days before the incident in the chapel, the Pope gave orders to gather his genealogical documents and seal them in an iron box, for after my death, defilement will begin. He never got up again. The festering wounds on his back burst every morning, and the bodies of the servants who cleaned them were later burned without burial. Officially, they died of fever. The servants and cardinals began to distance themselves. Only an old monk remained in the room, deaf and mute, who was said to have the ability to pray without substance, without a voice. He wrote on the walls with chalk, "There is a hole in him, and he is rotting from the inside." The day of communion arrived. The Pope flatly refused to miss the service. He was seated with his legs covered with a cloth treated with vinegar and sandalwood. Censer were placed around the throne. He was silent. When the bread was brought, his hand twitched, and then worms appeared from the folds of the cloth on his legs. They crawled slowly, as if they had just awakened. One fell to the floor. The deacon threw down the gift with a cry. The guards stood between him and the hall. Dad coughed up blood. At that moment, he began to retch, and according to an eyewitness, a living clot came out of his mouth. One of the monks later swore that it was a larva. Panic ensued. The lights went out. One of the younger priests fell into hysterics. The chapel was aired out and cleaned for several days. The next day, he no longer spoke. He only whispered. His body was covered with ulcers that gaped down to the muscles. His eyes were sunken. His pupils had disappeared under his eyelids. No living creature could wash him anymore. He ordered no one to approach him, and everyone obeyed. A day later, he died, silently, at dawn. But that was not the end of it. The body remained on the throne for more than 8 hours. No one dared to touch him. The body was covered with a thick cloth soaked in myrrh, and a guard was posted at the door. The senior valet was sent for a council, but only one of the 7 doctors agreed to come closer, and even then, only wearing a mask, with a resin-soaked beak and a bundle of juniper in his hands. He wrote in the journal, "The corpse no longer retained its density, was releasing gases and fluids, was the color of green wax, the abdomen was distended, and there was movement in the eye sockets." A day later, the body was touched for the first time. It was carried by 4 men, all wearing gloves, leather aprons, and skirts rolled up to their knees. Despite the windows being open, the stench was unbearable. According to one of the pallbearers, the sweet smell of rot stabbed the nose like a knife. That same evening, 2 people fell ill with a fever. It later emerged that one had died that day, and the other had disappeared without a trace. The embalming of the body took place in 2 stages, both of which violated the regulations. A standard autopsy was not performed for fear of spreading the infection. Instead, the Pope's body was smeared with a thick solution of vinegar, laurel, and arsenic. When the abdomen was opened, the instruments broke. The contents of the wound flowed out, resembling honey with larvae. One of the assistants fainted. It was then decided to stop the autopsy and limit the procedure to a superficial washing and fumigation with resin smoke. At the same time, internal panic began. The Pope's death was announced only on the 3rd day, officially because of the need for prayer and preparatory ceremonies. In reality, it was because there was no clear plan for succession. The internal council of 4 cardinals could not reach an agreement. 2 insisted on the candidacy of a young French archbishop supported by the king. The 3rd, a native of Genoa, promoted the nephew of the former pontiff. The 4th, a German, argued that the throne should remain vacant temporarily until a divine sign. Meanwhile, rumors spread with superhuman speed. In the shops, people said that the Pope had died from a curse put on him by a heretic, burned at the stake in Toulouse a year earlier. Others said that he wore an amulet on his chest and secretly confessed to an occultist. Black-robed figures were seen in the square, drawing circles with chalk at the entrance to the cathedral courtyard. 5 were arrested and later executed without trial. 1 shouted before his death that the Pope was "embraced from within." Services were cancelled. The domes of the cathedrals were shrouded in smoke. The water in the fountains turned green. It later turned out that this was due to a dead rat stuck in the sewer, but the city was already gripped by terror. People burned incense right on the streets. Self-flagellation began. The prices of salt and vinegar tripled. Foreign delegations were allowed to see the Pope's body only on the 5th day. By that time, it was wrapped in 3 layers of cloth and lay in a coffin lined with iron and sealed with a church seal. The French ambassador refused to enter the hall, citing suffocating miasma. The imperial representative sent an encrypted letter to Vienna stating, "The body has decomposed beyond recognition. Even the servants do not want to look at it." On the same day, the book of the last confession disappeared. According to tradition, the Pope had to dictate it to one of his close associates and seal it with a sign. The name of the copyist is listed in the archives as Brother Damien, who disappeared the next day. His body was found a week later in a monastery cistern without a tongue and with the skin torn from his face. The following night, an incident occurred that was whispered about for a long time. One of the guards on duty at the coffin committed suicide. Before his death, he screamed that he could hear voices coming from inside. The second guard disappeared. After that, the coffin was moved to the lower crypt. The entrance was sealed, and the walls were anointed with myrrh. The guards were replaced with new ones who were not among the inner circle. On the 6th day after his death, the body was taken from the residence at night. The coffin was chained shut and accompanied by at least 24 horsemen. The procession moved in silence. Legend has it that dogs howled throughout the city that night. Meanwhile, tension was mounting in the halls of the Council of Cardinals. 2 of them, supporters of France, had been poisoned. One died immediately. The other survived, but lost his speech. Suspicions fell on the servants, but later evidence emerged that the poison had been added to a wine jug on the common table. Secret denunciations began. Letters were sealed twice, and messengers were interrogated. Some began to claim that the Pope himself, despite his death, was influencing events. The senior nun from the cell, where he had been washed before his illness, swore that she had seen a handprint with 6 fingers on the wall. The report of this was destroyed on the orders of the acting pontiff. But rumors continued to spread like worms under white cloth. The coffin with the body was not opened. Instead of a public funeral service, a short prayer service was held behind closed doors. Legend has it that the censer at the altar had to be replaced 3 times. The silver blackened from the heat, and the smoke was heavier than usual. On the 7th day, the coffin was sealed in a lead sarcophagus and walled up in the crypt. Access to it was forbidden, even to the highest clergy. One of the masons later claimed that at the moment the lid was placed on the coffin, he heard a scraping sound from inside. His testimony was not recorded, but according to legend, he was found dead a week later with his throat torn out. The Pope's death marked the beginning of the end of a peaceful reign. The conclave was moved, the Inquisition tightened its surveillance, and the city was plunged into fear. When the doors of the crypt closed forever, it was as if a lead bell had descended on the city. The procession dispersed without singing or blessing. Several cardinals, standing away from the coffin, exchanged brief glances. Each of them understood that the power vacuum created by the pontiff's death would draw them all in. The very next morning, a request was submitted to the archives to open the will, but the seals had been broken and the book was charred and partially torn. The monk who had kept it confessed that the former Holy Father had come to him in a dream and ordered him to burn what was written. In the inner courtyard of the papal palace, several servants were chained and thrown into dungeons. One of them, a valet who had stood at the sickbed until the very end, confessed under torture that he had seen the Pope tearing out his own nails before his death and calling not to God but to his mother, who had died 60 years earlier. His testimony was not recorded, and his body was found with his chest torn open. The servants who remained alive began to sprinkle ashes in their food and drink vinegar, so that the rot of the Holy Father would not spread through touch. His name was no longer mentioned at the cardinals' meetings. He was referred to simply as he. Secret meetings were held in Castel Sant'Angelo, under Swiss guard, to discuss whether to allow the German envoy to participate in the election of a new pontiff. The old charter required the consent of all 4 branches of the Curia, but 2 bishops were on the verge of insanity. One was delirious, the other had gone into seclusion. Rumors circulated that it was they who had been on duty at the deceased's chambers in his final days, and had seen worms crawling over his face even before his heart stopped. Servants carried sandals, pillows, and curtains out of the palace. Everything was to be burned. One of the chaplains responsible for disposal described in a letter to his brother that when the Pope's headdress was burned, the smell of meat filled the air, even though it was only cloth. He never wrote another letter. His body was found at the bottom of a well. His hands were broken and his tongue had been torn out. The medicine of the time was powerless against death, but not against fear. Doctors claimed that the Pope's illness could have been the result of internal decay caused by black bile, which explained his hallucinations, mental confusion, and inability to swallow during his last days. The chronicler of the cathedral noted in the margins, he spoke to the crows and demanded that Mass be said for them. At the same time, a ritual to expel evil spirits was performed. A priest burned the bones of pigeons and read prayers in 6 voices. After the ritual, he developed a fever and ulcers appeared on his skin. People said that he had been marked by the dead. Meanwhile, in remote parishes, a movement began that would later be called an internal heresy. People refused to pronounce the name of the deceased pontiff. Priests were afraid to read funeral services. In Venice, Naples, Florence, and even beyond the Alps, preachers appeared who claimed that the Pope's death was punishment for secret alliances with heretics. One of them, a preacher dressed in rags, was captured, tied to a stake, and burned alive in the square. Before his death, he cried out, "Worms are his angels." Writers recorded that on the night before the execution, 3 stars passed across the sky, and one of them pulsated like an open wound. The nuns of the convent of St. Ursula claimed that they saw a bloody stain in their refectory that could not be removed with water or salt. The guards sent to investigate concluded that the stain was a trace of spilled wine, but the Mother Superior refused to abandon the sign version, and soon the convent was sealed off. The situation in the cardinal circles became critical. 4 contenders for the throne remained alive. Each had his own faction. One was supported by France, another by Austria, a third by a coalition of northern dioceses, and the fourth was the illegitimate son of a former pope, secretly ordained. Disappearances began among those close to the pope. The clerk who had compiled the list of voters vanished without a trace. His pen and inkwell were found in a fountain, and the dog that had accompanied him every night was strangled. A second autopsy was performed in secret, 9 days after the burial. According to reports, it was the initiative of 2 cardinals who suspected poisoning. 3 people, a monk, an executioner, and a doctor, entered the crypt. Only one came out. He raved that the sarcophagus inside was moving. He was isolated in a separate cell. 2 days later, he committed suicide. The autopsy report was never presented. Later, an entry appeared in the archives. Upon autopsy, numerous worms were found. The body structure was absent. The tissue was completely decomposed, and the skull was empty. One of the bishops who had advocated for an autopsy suddenly disappeared. A few days later, he was found in a river, bound and with his mouth sewn shut. On his chest was written, "Do not touch." Superstition overwhelmed even the highest hierarchs. Some began to wear belts with pieces of silver. Others slept with knives under their pillows. Rumors spread that the pontiff would return, that his soul had not found peace. One of the monks claimed to have seen someone walking through the courtyard at night, wearing a robe that glowed in the dark. The cells with the captured heretics were blocked off. The water in the cisterns was lit with salt. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt, Rome, and Avignon, secret negotiations were underway between the crowned heads about who to recognize as Pope. The Holy Roman Emperor threatened secession. The French king sent a letter stating bluntly, "If the pontiff is not elected within a month, France reserves the right to appoint its own." This letter was read out in the council. One of the oldest cardinals threw it into the fire, saying, "We already live without a pope. Let there be no more." That same evening, a fire broke out in St. Peter's Cathedral. The flames engulfed 2 side chapels, and the vaults darkened. The cause, an unquenched candle, was officially recognized, but rumors circulated that it was a sign. 3 brothers died in the fire. One, who was pulled out with burns, said he heard singing coming from under the floor. He died 2 days later. Through the mouths of the dead monks, the living spoke. Fear intertwined with power, and power dissolved into pus. The 5th day after the fire, the Pope's palace is empty. In the inner garden, behind the burnt-out grates, sits a single old man. It is Brother Eugene, the deaf chronicler, who was forgotten and left behind with the servants. He fills the last lines on the parchment with the last drops of ink, writing with a trembling hand. No one came for me. There are worms in the well. The dead are not silent. In the palace, there are no prayers, no smell of incense, only wet walls and cracked floorboards where the vault of the underground crypt has collapsed. Where the Pope once lay, there is now a gaping hole. The earth collapsed, the coffin sank deeper, and the smell of death wafted from the crack. One of the guards assigned to the site tried to burn incense, but soon fled, shouting that he had seen the face of the dead man glowing below, and it was breathing. Meanwhile, an extraordinary council was held in Siena, without the consent of Rome, and without the participation of some of the cardinals. A new pope was proclaimed, a member of the Italian nobility, close to the merchant guilds and the Tuscan families. The name of the former pontiff was not mentioned at all. The new pope vowed not to speak of his predecessor. His enthronement took place secretly, without pomp. No one dared to place the crown of the deceased on his head. It was burned. A new one was made, simple, with a cross, without precious stones. Upon arriving in the Vatican, the new pontiff refused to enter his former chambers. He ordered them to be cleansed with fire and filled with wax. All the crosses in these rooms were cut down. The walls were boarded up. The place of communion, where worms had crawled out of the body of the deceased on the day of the Eucharist, was filled with lead and covered with a carpet. The participants in that ritual, 3 deacons, disappeared. One was found in a river with his eyes gouged out, another in a monastery, insane, gnawing on his own hands. The third was never found. Rumors spread throughout Europe. In Lyon, it was said that the former pope would return in the body of a baby. In Prague, it was said that he was a servant of the devil, and that wars would break out because of him. In Trier and Mainz, old papal bulls were burned, citing the smell of sulfur emanating from them. Peasants who had received absolution during his reign sought out priests again to count everything. An old man in Padua came to the temple and cried, "He forgave me for adultery, but now I don't know if God or a worm has forgiven me." In Saxony and Swabia, bishops refused to commemorate the deceased in Mass. In Scandinavia, his name was replaced with "the one who was." The German emperor sent a letter to the new pope, demanding that the previous one be recognized as nameless. In response, he received silence. The diplomat who delivered the message died on his way back from a fever, which was attributed to the dampness of the Vatican. The embalmers who worked on the body died one after another, 5 of them. One of them, before he died, shouted that the body laughed while he was sewing up the chest. Another said that he had found a copper ring in the intestines that no one had put there. A search of the embalmer's workshop revealed bundles of hair pulled from the deceased's mouth and nails. All records relating to the procedure disappeared. The monk who kept the diary went blind for no reason. The doctor who wrote a later treatise on decomposition added, "This was not a man, but a vessel of decay. The brain was white as a woodlouse. The heart was like a stone covered with wool. The flesh under the skin was black and slippery. The bones were hollow." Rumors of the Pope's return grew stronger. Children appeared in Rome claiming to hear a voice coming from the sarcophagus. One boy said that an old man in white is calling his name, asking him to come down. He was found dead at the entrance to the crypt, his eyes open, and a handful of earth in his mouth. Access to the body was finally prohibited. The guard was ordered to seal the entrance to the crypt with iron. It was then that riots broke out across Europe. In Toulouse, a crowd stormed the bishop's residence, demanding a real Holy Father, not a rotting one. In Antwerp, the cathedral cross, a symbol of the former pontificate, was burned. In the German lands, people refused to pay tithes to Rome, citing the sinful body that had decayed before the eyes of the faithful. The new pope convened a council. It was decided to declare the previous pope unrested. Officially, he was not excommunicated, but he was not a saint either. His name was removed from the liturgy. Letters bearing his seal were declared invalid. The certificates he had issued were invalid. His episcopal appointments were called into question. His image was removed from frescoes. Statues were torn down. His ring was melted down. His motto was deleted from all books. But the fear remained. In monasteries, psalms of purification began to be read at night. Forbidden prayers appeared, addressed to the archangels, not for salvation, but for protection from the decay of the soul. Secret societies of hermits and desert dwellers said that the Pope's death was punishment for the pride of the Church. One monk in northern France wrote in his Chronicle, "He did not die in body, his spirit decayed first. We saw worms not on his skin, but in his eyes, while he was still looking at us." The Pope's death was the beginning. Within 3 years of this incident, 3 cardinals died under strange circumstances. 6 more disappeared. Episcopal conclaves were no longer held in their previous composition. Trust in Rome fell. In some dioceses, popular masses began without the participation of the clergy. In Germany, reform movements intensified. In England and France, there was a movement for church self-government. In the cemetery outside the city walls, where all those who had served at the papal court were buried, the ground was dug up. Locals said that at night someone walked among the graves, whispering. Traces led from the crypt of the late pontiff to the church. The stones there were charred, and candles went out immediately after being lit. The last decree of the new pope was an order, never again to bury high priests within the city. Their bodies were to be buried outside the walls. Their graves were to be unmarked. Their flesh was to be turned to ashes, so that they would never return. But the people remembered it differently. They said, "He died on the altar, and worms came out of him, because his soul had left him first." And since then, in every church where communion is read, candles are lit twice. One is for God, the second is so that the rot does not return.